Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist and a psychologist who conducted a series of experiments in the early 20th century pertaining to digestion. His experiments with saliva and dogs' digestive processes accidentally discovered associative learning. Thanks to Pavlov and his dogs, this theory was able to develop and lead to applications in our world today. A lot of people don't actually know that Pavlov was not a psychologist at all. He did not like the field of psychology, but his research as a physiologist helped create the field of behaviorism. His experiments yielded many insights into the study of reflexes and greatly contributed towards the behaviorist movement. Now, before we continue, there are some key vocabulary that we should know. A stimulus is something that exists in the surroundings or that is present. Response is how the animal or us responds to the stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that leads to a certain response without previous training, such as food. The conditioned stimulus is an ordinary neutral stimulus that after training leads to a conditioned response. In this example, the bell goes from being neutral to being conditioned. Conditioned response. The response caused by a conditioned stimulus. Unconditioned reaction. Reaction that occurs naturally and automatically when unconditioned stimulus is present. What Pavlov's experiment is. Pavlov conducted his experiment by restraining dogs in an experiment chamber and were given meat powder, and their saliva was then collected through a surgical implant. Once the experiment continued, Pavlov noticed that the dogs began to salivate before the food was given to them because they would see the handler or hear them coming. He then would accompany the meat powder with different stimuli, specifically a bell in this case, and then would record the dog's saliva levels. The dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell without the meat present. In his experiment, the meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus. The dog's salivation is the unconditioned response. The bell is a neutral stimulus. However, once the dog begins to associate the bell with the food, it then becomes a conditioned stimulus, and this leads to the conditioned response of salivating at the sound of the bell. Here is a good example of classical conditioning in real life.
Reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid?
What do you think?
Dwight, want an Altoid?
Okay.
Altoid?
Sure.
What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
As you can see in this scenario, the unconditioned stimulus was the offer of an Altoid, which Dwight did without training. Over time, the Windows startup sound, which is the conditioned stimulus, was paired with the offer of an Altoid. Over time, Dwight associated the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Thus, when the conditioned stimulus was unpaired with the conditioned response, Dwight's response was the same as if it had not been unpaired. Pavlov once said, "Science demands from a man all his life. If you had 2 lives, that would not be enough for you. Be passionate in your work and in your searching." During our pursuit of knowledge for Pavlov's dogs, we had some questions that remained unanswered, so we decided to get in contact with our professor, Michael Mills, a man of many talents. We trusted what he had to say.
The first time I heard about Pavlov's experiment was probably when I was a freshman college student at UCLA taking intro psych.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. God, it's such a long time ago. I don't think I remember. Actually, I thought the experiment was really interesting. I thought it was very interesting that you could collect empirical data about behavior and come to some sort of derive certain principles about behavior, and that really got me interested in the field.
Do you have any
Well,
critiques?
radical behaviorism, the behaviorism that I was taught, social learning theory, was kind of B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism at the time, and it's argued that that there are a set of learning principles, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, that operate pretty much the same between different species. And what has changed over time is that we know that that's not the case, that different species are wired up to learn certain things more easily, and other things they don't learn very well or not at all. I show a cartooning class of Pavlov doing his study with cats and how that might have been different from, they might have responded differently than dogs. So I think that's one thing that may have changed since I first learned about it. Oh yeah, yeah. Classical conditioning is very powerful. It operates pretty much unconsciously. Advertisers rely on classical conditioning all the time. They pair their product with, attractive people out at the lake looking like they're having a great time. So you think you have positive associations with whatever product that they're promoting. So advertisers use classical conditioning all the time. In fact, in many commercials, the pairing is done very subtly, or maybe at the end of the commercial. So they don't tell you how great their product is. They just associate their product with great things, and you come to have positive associations with it, which you're not consciously aware of. So when you go in the supermarket or something and you see the product, you have positive feelings toward it.
Research purposes?
There's been so much research done on classical conditioning that it's pretty much a closed topic now. It's like, it's not like we're trying to verify the effect. The effect is pretty much well established. So there might be studies on very specific aspects of classical conditioning that are going on today, but pretty much, there's not too many studies on gravity and physics. It's pretty much a closed topic. You could replicate his study now, and you'd find the same results, I'm pretty sure. Some studies in psychology, or most recently, there's been what's called a replication crisis. That is, some very well-known effects in psychology that we thought were pretty well established. Turns out that if you try to replicate the study today, you don't find the same results. But with classical conditioning, I think that you pretty much would find the same results.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome.
We decided to set off on a quest of our own, like modern-day cowboys, to discover the hidden truth behind Pavlov's dogs. We discovered our answer to be in a far, far away land with strange new creatures, and to our surprise, our answer was the English bulldog.
Abby. Abby.
To replicate Pavlov's experiment, we used our dog, Abigail. Here she is. Now, Abby loves to eat a lot of food, so we decided that the unconditioned stimulus would be some pizza. Her response to get up and come get the food is a natural response, so that would be the unconditioned response. We decided to use a ring as the conditioned stimulus, and her response to run towards us when the ring sound comes on is the conditioned response.
God, all right.
Oh my God.
As Pavlov's work became more well known in the West, especially through the writings of John B. Watson and B. F. Skinner, the idea of conditioning as an automatic form of learning became a key concept in the developing specialism of comparative psychology, and the general approach to psychology that underlaid it, that being behaviorism. John B. Watson conducted his own experiments on classical conditioning, except his experiments utilized a human subject. He used a little boy named Albert and a little white rat. Initially, Albert showed no fear to the little white rat, but Watson began to pair the white rat with repeated loud and scary sounds, causing the child to cry. Over time, Albert began to cry whenever the white rat was present, even if there were no loud sounds. This fear generalized to other fuzzy white objects, which Albert had learned to fear. Many phobias can arise out of classical conditioning, such as a fear of dogs, where individuals have associated dogs with painful bites or painful experiences. Pavlov's work with classical conditioning was of huge influence to how humans perceive themselves, their behavior, learning processes, and his studies of classical conditioning continue to be central to modern behavior therapy. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell observed that, quote, whether Pavlov's methods can be made to cover the whole of human behavior is open to question. But at any rate, they cover a very large field, and within this field, they have shown how to apply scientific methods with quantitative exactitude. No Abbeys were harmed during the making of this video.